Metadata is something unique and something they never saw before. You've actually been using metadata for many years. It's been part of the Windows operating system and directory structures for, again, many years. They've enhanced it, added more capabilities, more columns. Each column is considered to be a metadata item. When you look at a directory, and what I have on the screen right now is just a normal document library. Document library, not in SharePoint, document library on my local drive. So under My Documents, I'm basically showing the first couple of files, and I'll scroll down because I don't want to go through the folders, but so we've got a bunch of files in here, and you have a file name. There's actually something else called a file title. The file name and the title, they're two different things, two different ways you can reference a document. In Word, you actually can see the difference between the two, but normally most people don't see that there's actually something called a title. A title is a user-friendly version of that file name. But what you see whenever you see the word name, whether it's SharePoint or the operating system, that's the physical file name, the way it's stored on disk. So you'll see an extension like .doc, .docx, .exl, or anything else that you might have. So you see a couple of PDFs down there a little bit further. These are basically documents. So in some ways, even the name is metadata about the actual document, because it's not the document, it's just a way of referring to the document. So it's telling you information about the document. Next to that is a column for date created and date modified. That's also provided by default within Windows Explorer. And I said Windows Explorer, not Internet Explorer, Windows Explorer, so that every time you put a document in a library, the first time you put it in, it gets a date created. And if you go in and you modify that document at a later point, it will get a modified date that's different from the date created. If they're the same, then that means that document was added to the directory and never changed since it was added. There's also a column for type. And I'm going to scroll over a little bit so you can see some of the other columns. Type, basically, in the case of your normal Windows folders, are going to be things like Microsoft Word documents, Excel documents, PDF documents, HTML documents, text files, and so forth. And you see a couple of the variations there. But there's just about anything that manufacturer of software could want to create, as long as it's a different extension. And it's based upon that 3-letter extension to the file name. Then you have the size in KB, kilobytes. And then finally, who was the author of that particular document, if it knows. Now, the difference between some of those documents up there that have it and some that don't, if you look carefully, you'll notice that Microsoft Word always puts in an author. And that's based upon some of the setup information when you install Office. If you provide a username for the person when you install Office, then every document they create will automatically have a username associated with it. If you look at some of the other ones like Adobe, they don't have that capability. So the author field will be left blank. It won't know what to do with that. So that's a function of the way the individual software programs deal with some of these columns. There are a lot of other columns, but I want to show you just the fact that in any of these columns, and this is within DOS or just within your Windows directories, you've always had some capability of playing with the metadata. For instance, when I open the drop-down that's next to type, you get all these different options. These are actually filtering options. It allows you to filter. So if you know that you're looking for a document that's going to be a Microsoft Excel worksheet, if you just select that option, you don't have to look at your whole directory. You just select the type of file that you want. That's an example of how metadata can be used to find things, because you don't have to search through all the documents. If you want to look for HTML, if you want to look for file folders, if you want to look for text documents. So basically, you can filter on anything that you want. If you just open the directory and you just click on a file, let's not do file type, let's do name. If you click on name, it will sort either, well, it's always going to be alphabetical, but when you keep on clicking, it changes between alphabetical ascending and alphabetical descending. Now, the other thing that Windows does with its directories is it puts all the folders at the top. But it still does the ascending descending. So right now you see a folder named zip at the top, whereas if I click it again, add in express is at the top. So just by clicking on the name, you get different sort orders, and by using the drop down, you get to filter on some of the fields. So that's an example of a normal document library with metadata. Also in Windows, this is a music library, so if you have MP3s stored in a music folder, and when I say a music folder, when you first install Windows, you'll get something called My Music. If you use that and create folders underneath, it will automatically know to use these columns. And you get a title. Well, first you get a number, title, the length. The length in this particular case is going to be, that's right, I had to restart this machine. I didn't load another program. Let me load another program real quick. The length of any of those files when it's a music file is no longer, well, you could display the size and get the size in kilobytes, but the length, what might be more important is minutes and seconds, how long that particular music file is, the date that it was created. The name column here is a concatenation of information. It's the track number as well as the title. And if you scroll over, just as an example, in this particular case, you have an album artist, who the composers were, the name of the album, and who contributing artists might be if there's multiples for maybe a collection instead of a single artist. So that's, again, metadata. It's information about the files that are there. And the third one I'm going to show is a picture library. And again, we're going to start off with, across the top, a name for the file, which has the extension, the GIF or JPEG or whatever you might have, PNG files. Then a date that it was created. But the next column is something a little different, dimensions. It'll give you the size of that image in pixels. So that first one at the top is 147 pixels across by 94 pixels high. So it's a quick way to tell how large that particular image is going to be. Now, pixels from a file, from an image file, directly correspond to pixels on your screen. Now, maybe we have larger screens here, and we might go up to 1900 by 1200 or 1400 pixels for a screen here, but a lot of people on their home computers might still be back at the 1000 by 768. So when you look at, for instance, that second one, which is 42, almost 4,300 pixels by 3,200 pixels. Probably something like a 14 megapixel camera took that. That one would require 4 screens wide and about 3 to 4 screens high. So if it was a 4x4, you'd need 16 screens to show that picture full size. Would you ever put an image like that on a web page? No. And part of the reason is, look at the size of it, the actual physical size. The physical size is over 2 meg. And what you really would probably wind up doing is you would take it into a program, and Windows Office has a program to do this. There's a picture manager program that allows you to go in, open up a picture, and resize it. So you don't need any special tools. It doesn't cost you anything to do it. And you would probably resize it. I'm going to get down to this one. The one that I'm pointing at right now is 400 by 285. That's more likely what you would have on a web page. Notice that one's only about 22K. So going from 2 megabytes down to 22K, that's 1/100th the size. That's means a couple of things. When you create a web page and you put an image on it, that full image file is transmitted across the internet to their home, to their computer. Has to be downloaded. before it gets displayed. So if you have a 2 megapixel image, that whole 2 megapixels has to go across the wire to them. That takes a lot more time than a 22K picture. And there's actually some websites that are available online. They're free to use. And you can put in what the size of the file is, and it will tell you based upon different types of internet connections how long it would take you to download these different files in seconds, minutes, hours, days. Now the example I want to do real quick is there was a school several years ago that was going through some reconstruction, and they wanted to show pictures of the reconstruction on their website, on their home page. Fundamentally, not a bad idea. They had about halfway down the page, a little bit below the fold, a series of 6 images that went across the page. So each image as displayed was only 100 pixels wide by 70 pixels high. But the original source of those pictures were closer to the next line down, the 3264 by 2448. So you can see even those are about 2 meg in size for each of them. And there were 6 of them just going across that middle line. Plus there were another half a dozen similar sized images on the rest of the page. They were complaining that people in the public could not see their website, that people would try to go to their website and nothing would come up. Exactly. Because if you go out and you look at the calculations of how long it would take to download about 24 megabytes of pictures, of images, it came out to be close to a half an hour. So yeah, people would think that there was nothing on their site. As opposed to that 400 by 285, that's even larger than what they needed for those 6 images in the center. So it might have been even half of that. It may have been only 10K. So having 6 10K images to download for the page, it comes down almost immediately. So after making that change to their page suddenly was available now to the public. No one had problems seeing it, and it solved their problem. But what I'm getting at is that this metadata is available. You don't need a special tool to find out how large your files are. This metadata is available just by looking in your Windows directory and looking at your file and seeing what's there. Now, if that particular column doesn't show up initially, and it might not, what you can do is right-click on any of these at the top. It's going to show you what is selected, and usually the ones that are selected are going to be ones at the very top. They're going to have check marks. And then everything else below it are going to be fields that either are recommended, or if you click on more, you get the full list. And it's alphabetical. These are all the different pieces of metadata that are potentially possible in any type of directory listing. Now, not all of them apply to every type of file. Obviously, if you put a dimension column in a library that has nothing but shared documents, Word documents, it's not going to have any meaning. But you can certainly go out there and you can look at what's available, play with different options, play with the different columns, and maybe find some interesting information out about your files. But this is metadata. And the way I was able to just sort by things and filter by things, you've had all along. And all they've done in SharePoint essentially is include that capability. Now, part of the reason why we look at metadata. There are 2 main reasons why we look at metadata. I'm going to show you some examples of metadata in action in SharePoint sites. But first, what were some of the problems? Why did we start looking at metadata as a better solution than using folders when we define our libraries? The first one is that by using metadata, you can eliminate some problems of folders within folders within folders within folders within folders within folders, and so forth, all the way down. Sometimes I've seen as many as 10 levels of folders before you get to the actual file. So you give someone a file, you give them a link to a file, they open the file, they make some edited changes to it, they want to save it back, they forget exactly where it was. They're trying to navigate through this structure, almost like a tree branch structure, but inverted, almost like the roots of a tree, trying to find where to save this file. They can't figure it out. They finally give up. They create a new folder. And now you got 2 copies of the document sitting out there. Then person B comes along They find the one copy and they make some changes. Person C comes along, they find the other copy and they make changes to it. And slowly over time you start getting divergent versions and you don't have a single copy that has all the changes in anymore. That's a huge problem. We've seen it. We've had some situations here in the district where people have had very complex directory structures. They've run into problems. They come to us and they say, we've got these two different versions of supposed to be the same file, but it doesn't have the same data in it. Yeah, we know. Too bad. So sorry. Can't do anything about it. You can look at it line by line and see if you can fix it, but good luck. So having, instead of all these different branches and down within different folder structures, if there were a way that we could keep a library with no folders, that everything would be in one directory structure and we use filtering of the column headers and sorting of the column headers to find things, you won't have as much of a problem. Even if you had thousands of documents in the library, if you have the proper column definitions and you filter on those columns, you can find things very quickly. This person, and I won't mention who it was or what the department was, but they fought us for years. They didn't want to make any changes. They insisted folders were the way to go. After all, you learned how to use folders decades ago. I mean, since computer disks came out, the big 5¼ inch floppy disk, you were taught to use folders. So that's what everybody is familiar with. Well, Microsoft no longer says that. Microsoft says to use the metadata and not have any folders. And this is true actually even in your local drive. You could do the same thing, not just SharePoint. So the point that they're trying to get at is, and the point that he got to, is how fast, how quickly can we find data if we switch? After he started resorting his data and getting rid of the folders, he was so impressed by how easy it was to find files by just filtering on the columns that he's become more of an evangelist of this technique than any of the rest of us are. He goes around and he tells other departments, get rid of your folders. Okay? You heard Doug even say it during his presentation in the video. One of the tasks that he had for the following summer, which he got moved before he had a chance to do, but one of his tasks was to get rid of all the folders. We had a couple of other schools that were part of the pilot. And I forget which one it was, but one of them came back and they said during their presentation that when they first went through the class and we told them about metadata and getting rid of folders, they thought we were just kidding, so they went and used folders. They realized before the end of the year that was a mistake, and they were also going back and getting rid of their folders and using metadata. So it's something that's been tried and true. Another reason why it's good to have metadata, if it's implemented correctly, is you get around problems of misspellings. Misspellings from the standpoint of what those folder names are, what used to be folders, and what the columns are going to have as possible values. So those things will help you in the long run too. But I'm going to start by showing you a couple examples. I'm going to show you some from a while back that we created back in SharePoint 2010, because it doesn't matter what version of SharePoint, metadata works the same. And then we're going to work our way up to your current sites and how newsletters are put together and why it's important to use metadata for a lot of things, not just for your directories, for looking at your files. What I'm showing right now is the extracurricular activities page that's externally facing. Those of you that are from elementary schools, you don't have to do this, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you're in middle school or high school, you have to put out a list of all the extracurricular activities, who's responsible for them, when they occur, when the tryouts are, and so forth. This is a requirement, must get done. Legal department requires this every year. So you start building out this file, and people at the schools actually put the data in. Unfortunately, at the time we built this, is several years old, we did some things incorrectly. Instead of giving them a drop-down list for the schools, we allowed them to enter their school name. That was a big mistake. And actually, if you look at the screen in the front, the other day I said there were 2 mistakes in the screen. There's actually 3 mistakes in the screen. Now I'm going to tell you what they are. The first one is a Popka middle. Is it a Popka Memorial middle or is it a Popka middle? that extra word, as far as the computer's concerned, makes it a different school. Now, you and I know it's the same school, and parents may even know it's the same school, but the computer doesn't. So when somebody put the word memorial inside, even if that's in a way correct, it is incorrect in terms that it did not group with the other 16. Those numbers in parentheses, those are the number of activities under each of those school names. So there's a total of 17 activities for Apopka Middle, but one of them got misclassified under the wrong school. Scrolling down a little bit further, you have Arbor Ridge K-8 and just Arbor Ridge School. Same problem. That K-8 makes a big difference. And the last one I want to show, the two close to the bottom, not the last one, but the Chain of Lakes. There's a 13 and a 1. One is Chain of Lake Middle School, and the other is Chain of Lakes Middle School. You with that S. And sometimes you got to hunt to find these. Some of the worst ones I've had to find when they had 2 spaces between words. Yes, that makes a difference because it thinks those are different. The worst case that I saw when we first did any of these is when they misspelled things wrong. They misspelled the school name wrong. But as bad as that was, some of them misspelled school. S-C-H-O-L. This is an outward-facing site. It doesn't really look good. So one of the problems when you allow users to enter the data when you are using metadata is the spelling consistency of all the words. Case doesn't matter, but spelling definitely does. So I'm just going to switch over just for a second to look at the raw data. And when I scroll down, you can see as I'm scrolling down, there's a lot of records. But when I scroll down all the way to the bottom, I still actually don't get to the bottom. It stops. Yeah, I tried to scroll too far. Okay, forget that tab. I'm opening up a new tab. Oh, that was the one that had the error. And you notice how long it takes for the page to even come up initially. It's because this particular file, if I go to Site Actions and View All Site Content, this file has not a lot, but it's got 2,388 documents in it. We've seen larger. We've seen one document library with over 9,000 files.
Tech requests.
Yes. Yeah. So we can actually get a lot larger than that, but as you get larger, they get slower and slower. So what I want to show here is with the metadata, if you were looking for something, right now everything is listed by alphabetically by school name. So if you come over to school name and scroll down through, you'll go through the various schools. But if you were in one of the schools that were in the middle, say Maitland Middle, trying to scroll down to find that, because it's only going to show me 250 records at a time. Can we change that? Yeah, you can, but I would not recommend making it the 2,388 either, because it would take quite a while for that page to come up and display. And that's because the system would have to bring in all the data and format the page, format those columns and rows, and that takes time. Formatting all the columns and rows for 30 records, which is the default, doesn't take too long, so that's why it's the default. We changed it to 250. It's a little bit more of a delay. It actually starts to get noticeable. But making it 2,388 records, you're going to wonder if there's something going on that the system failed. So if you wanted to find Maitland, you're not going to be able to scroll down to them. But what you can do is you can come over to school name, use the drop down, and you'll see all the unique school names. Again, it's unique school names. So that's why when you look at the list, you're going to see those duplicates I mentioned earlier. But at least this way, I can open up that list of school names, come down to find Maitland, and notice even here we have Maitland Middle and Maitland Middle School. I'm going to select the second one because I think that's the one with all the data. Looks like I was right. So this is supposed to be all the activities that are supposed to be at Maitland Middle. And it's not as bad of a list. I can scroll down on this one, and it's not terrible. I mean, they do have a lot of things going on, but it's not a terrible list. But it's still quite a few items. So maybe you want to look next at who the coach is. Oh, by the way, you notice the little filter next to school name? That's letting you know that you are filtering by something. So if you open the drop down, you can always get a reminder of what you're going to filter by, because you'll see it with a check mark in the front of it. So let's look at the who the directors are of these different activities. We get the drop down, and we could sort alphabetically and try to find the person that way. But I want to call your attention to a couple of other things on this list. And again, why it's very important to be consistent when you put information in. While we could possibly give you a list of all the schools for the drop down for the school name, I don't know if it's possible for us to give you a list of all the possible athletic directors. That may be asking too much, because there's no way to pull that out of Active Directory. As a result, people are typing it in. When they type it in, they're not always consistent in the way they type it in. If you look at the list, there's a couple of them that look like they could possibly be duplicates. Coach Kugel is probably the same person as the one second from the bottom, Shatoya Kugel. I'm guessing. I don't know for sure, but I think they're the same. Coach Neff is probably Kevin Neff. Again, I'm guessing. And that's because when you start entering things manually, you're never going to be sure if they entered it inconsistently and it's really the same person, or if it's supposed to be different people. So in this particular case, I want to look at one of them, the one I'm pointing at right now, Lori, because I want to see what she's responsible for. And I see that there's 2 records that she's responsible for. And I might want to take a look at what exactly it is. And I notice that the activity name, the team name, is YMCA After School Zone. And my first impression is, why 2 records? It's only 1 activity. Different principal names. Why? Okay, I'm going to go back over to the modified date. They're different years. They never deleted the data from last year. They added the new record, but didn't delete last year's records. Okay. Now, by using metadata, I can find those types of things fairly quickly. As you scroll through and look at data, and the person from that middle school probably should have been doing some of this and looking at their data. They obviously, in this case, didn't. But that's one of the advantages of metadata. If you had to look at 2,388 records, you'd never find that. But by applying filters and then looking at the results you get, it's a lot easier to determine if you have problems. Just like if you apply filters, can you find 2 files that have similar names and maybe they're the same document? Yeah. Maybe they were in 2 totally different folders before. Now, before I go on and show you some of the other ones, some of the other examples, let me just talk about how do you get rid of your folders and get to the point where you just use metadata. The way we described it to this person I mentioned earlier is you start looking at your directory structure. And you don't have to take notes on this because it's in our newsletter. This was an article in last month's newsletter. So just go out and look at our newsletter from last month and it'll give you the details of how to go about doing this. But let's say you have the root directory, and then within the root directory you have some subfolders. Make a list of all those subfolders, the names of them, and that becomes the values that are possible for column 1 of your metadata. Then all of the subfolders within that set of folders get their names. That becomes column 2 for your metadata, and the values of those folder names are the only possible values for column 2. And so on until you get rid of all the files, all the folders in your entire system. Can you skip one? Yes. A metadata column can be blank. It just means that if you search on a value within that column, it won't return that particular item. But can it be skipped? Yes. So depending on how you set up your folder structure, draw out your directory tree, and then just go down through the levels. And this makes a lot more sense because I color-coded them. If you go out and look at the newsletter, you'll see what I mean by going down through the levels of your folders to create the metadata. Let's look at another place where metadata comes in handy. Our portal help site, which you'll become very familiar with if you're not already, has a lot of documentation. And if you go to the documentation menu item, you get a flyout, and there are all these different other secondary options. Collaboration, general documentation, internet, intranet, school, and SharePoint 2010, and so forth. These are all going to give us different lists. For example, if I click on school, I get a page that has 3 columns. Within those 3 columns, there are various groupings of the documentation. By groupings, I mean things like ad-related guide, guidelines, how-to guides, tips and tricks, web part guides. Those are groupings of the files. And then within each of those groupings, there's 1 or more files within each grouping. That's kind of interesting. It gives you some information about when you're trying to do something, maybe you can find it a little bit easier through the groupings. Same thing is true for general documentation, but there's only 2 columns. But if you look at the 2 columns, some of the information, some of the groupings may be similar. Maybe they're not. They don't have to be. I'm going to go to internet, intranet, and it'll be the last one I show. And again, ad-related guide we saw before, guidelines we saw before, tips and tricks we saw before, but notice tips and tricks is in twice. And that's because one has an ampersand, one has the word and spelled out as A-N-D. And I've left it that way so I can use it as a demo example. But really what I should go back in to the data and change that column and get rid of the ampersand and put the word A-N-D in. So there's only one group. So how does this all get put together? Because each of these 3 pages I just showed you, they're very simple pages. They only have one web part on them. It's a content query web part. Every time I add a new document, I only add the document to the library. I have never edited these pages since the beginning. And even to fix that problem that I'm showing you right now, I don't have to edit the page. All I have to do is go in and edit the data that's related to that file, the metadata for the file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Site Actions, View All Site Content, go to Web Part Guides, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So the first 2 columns, the first column and the second column, they're the name and the title. The name column, like I said before, is the actual physical name of the file. It probably, in this case, has a PDF extension. The title is the title that's actually displayed to the user with a content query web part. And as you can see, they don't have to be exactly the same. They can be a little different. In this case, I was trying to make the titles a little bit shorter. but there's nothing saying that it has to be shorter. It can be longer, it can be more descriptive if the name of the file is very short. Then there's two columns that come after that. The first column is category. And the category column will determine how it breaks it down on the page. Some of those categories like governance, how-to guides, ad-related guide, web part guides. You saw those before on those other pages that I showed you. So that's where that's going to come into play, because I have to tell each document which grouping it belongs to within a page. And then the column on the right is going to be the column that determines what page that particular item falls on. So as I come down through and look at some of the other rows, you see some things are only on a single page, and they'll say things like general. I think that's the only one in this particular screen that appears on only a single page. But you have others, like right in the middle, where it says collaboration, comma, internet, intranet, schools, general, SharePoint 2010. That means that particular document appears on all 5 of those pages. And the way it's done with the content query web part is the content query web part lets you filter the data that you're pulling in from a library. You have to specify the library. You specify a filter. In this case, I'm specifying the filter to say it contains schools, or it contains general, or it contains any of the other words that are up there. So I can identify what page it belongs in. Yes, that means each page that I'm using must have something unique in its name, so I can filter on that criteria. Once it pulls the records only for things that belong on that page, then I use the category column to group the data, to group those files, and within the grouping, I sort alphabetically. If I want to add a new document, excuse me, if I want to add a new documentation file, all I need to do is upload the file, the PDF version of the file, tell it what page it has to be on, or pages, and I just happen to use commas to separate the page names, but quite honestly, it's not necessary. I could have left spaces, but it makes it easier for humans to read with the commas. And tell it how I want it grouped on the page, if it's one of the existing groups or if it's a new group. Okay? So with doing something like that, I can create relatively quickly a page that may look complex, but it's only a single web part with a few properties defined. What is it filtering on? How does it group the data within the page? And then within the group, how does it list things, in this case alphabetically? And I'm using the metadata from the library to do that. Now, the metadata that's in this library, the library by default doesn't have those columns like category or data type or page type. I add those columns to the library. They're like adding any other columns to any other library or to a list. I add the columns I want. If I want the end user to enter anything they want, it can be a text type. If I want to predefine what they can enter, I can do a couple of things. I can have a choice list in which I define in the definition of the column what the different possible values are. Or I can have it use a lookup table, another list, and from the lookup list, find out what those values are. Now, the advantage of the lookup list is I can go in and I can modify the list fairly easily and not have to modify the structure of the list itself. But those are some choices that when you start building these, try one or the other. If you have questions, let us know. Come to an open lab and we might be able to tell you the best way to approach it. So the last example of how I use metadata to do something is, and I'm going to use, this is actually on your sites already. An example of this is the newsletter and archive. Now, you won't have as many newsletters. You only have about 2 or 3. And this does not have our most recent newsletters updated all the time. Sometimes it has the old stuff. I see somebody's been playing and added the new one. I wonder who. 5 minutes? It doesn't matter. It'll just run out of tape.
I did yesterday. I was doing a video on how to.
Okay.
How to update.
But the point is that I created here a newsletter page that once I created the page, I'm never going to touch it again. It's got a current newsletter and it's got the newsletter archive. This was also in one of our past newsletters. And the Way this one is put together is the center portion is a page viewer web part that points to a very specific file name called current newsletter, but it could be anything you'd like. And then the web part over here is another content query web part where it's going to filter on things that have a page type of newsletter, and it's going to group by the year so that we get the years together. And within each year, I'm sorting in descending order on the name of the file. So if I were to open Site Contents and look at that, I'm going to look at just 2013 as an example for right now. And the main thing you want to look at is some of the information on the right-hand side. I have both the newsletter source and the newsletter itself. When you're displaying something to the outside public, we've probably told you or other people that you work with that you should be displaying only the PDF. And that's because people may not have the Microsoft document to be able to work with the source. I'm creating my newsletters with Publisher. How many people do you think have Publisher at home? Okay. So I create the PDF so that that's what's viewable to the outside world, and that's the one that has newsletter in that last column. Source is the actual publisher source document, so I can go back in and make changes. I put them in the same library for a reason. How many times do you have PDFs that are out on the internet, and then someone comes along and says you have to do an update to that document, and you have no idea where the source is? So what do you wind up doing? Recreating the whole document? It's not very efficient. So what I recommend doing is whenever you have something that you're displaying the PDF to the outside world or even within your school, put the source document in the same library. Just use a column, a metadata column in effect, to differentiate which one's source and which one's the one you publish. Is there anything special about the word source or newsletter? No, just the spelling of it. I could just have the letter N and S. It would work just as well, as long as I filter by those criteria. And then as far as sorting the data, well, grouping, first of all, is that second to last column is the year. And then sorting the data, I use either the name or the title. Now, I've been very careful with the names and titles for my newsletter so that I don't have a problem with January getting mixed in with October, November, and December. So in that first one where it says SharePoint Shots Volume 5, Number 1, it's not number space 1, it's number space 1, so that it sorts it in the right order. If I don't want to use that column for my sort criteria, I could use the other column, which is shorter, just has V5N01. Again, the 01 to differentiate it, to make sure it comes at the very beginning of the year, and N1, N11, or N10, N11, and N12 come at the end. If I just said N1 and N2 and N3, January would be mixed up inside of October, November, and December. So using this method, that's how I get the archive. Well, let me go back up to the top a little bit. Current newsletter, no year, no category, blank, because I really don't care. Because the page viewer web part is going to go out and grab a very specific page name from the library. And by not putting anything in year and category, I'm pretty sure that it's never going to show up